Hello, everyone. Welcome back to episode 11 of the Catholics Against Militarism podcast. We have Father McCarthy back here today. Welcome back, Father McCarthy.
Thank you, Ellen. Glad to be here with you.
Thanks. Father has been on our podcast several times already since it started back in May. And in the course of that time, some people have had a few questions for him. So they have commented on YouTube and asked questions. So I thought I would put a few of those together and maybe ask him some questions today. So the first question, Father McCarthy, this is actually a little bit more from me, that I would like to ask you for some explanation about is something that came up in the last podcast that I did with Father McNavish. Father McNavish had attended your last retreat that you gave before you retired in May of, I think, was it 2015 in Atlanta? And we were talking a little bit about that experience and how that affected him. And he said that he had never heard of Gospel Nonviolence before he went to that retreat. And he hasn't heard anybody in the church talk about it since. I'm sure you're not surprised by that. But anyway, so he said that it was a very interesting retreat, and he was referring to in the podcast I did with him, he was referring to pacifism. And he said, oh, yeah, I had never given much thought to pacifism before that. And so in the course of that conversation, I kind of corrected him and I said, well, I don't really believe that gospel nonviolence is the same thing as pacifism, but Father McCarthy would do a better job of explaining that than I would. So I promised him that I would ask you, what is the difference between pacifism and gospel nonviolence? I thought we could start with that today.
Well, I think that that's a good place to start. But in the 2-minute little soliloquy you gave there, I've made a few notes here about 8 corrections I have to make.
Oh, great! All right, what was it? What are the
Ellen, I'm not retired.
Oh, you're not?
I am not retired.
What are you? What are you?
I'm still out there proclaiming that Jesus was nonviolent and that his teachings and the Gospels are teachings of nonviolent love of friends and enemies, and calling each and every church, Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant, Evangelical, back to that truth which they have abandoned to the detriment of the church and of humanity. So it is true that the last retreat that I gave was in Atlanta, May 15th of 2015. But I'm still doing all kinds of things here. I'm working at gospel nonviolence every day.
Oh, well, okay. Thank you for clarifying that. And I will say that I know that you continue to answer a million emails every day from people like you, like me, who write to you and have questions. And so I guess I don't know everything that you're up to, so I shouldn't say you're retired.
Now, there you go. Another mistake. We're going to spin this whole thing here for talking about your mistakes. Now,
all these retractions, yeah.
I don't answer emails.
Oh, you don't?
No. Okay. I answer your emails.
Oh.
Because we have a history that goes back quite a bit. But just emails coming in off the street, I do not answer them because I get hundreds of them, and I can't do that because I'm all alone. I don't have a secretary. I'm not the Pope, with the whole battery of people to, or Johnny Carson or any of those Bob Hope who have their writers,
That's true.
So I just can't answer those things, and not because I don't want to. But this I will say about all the questions that come in. I have never had a question that has come into me over the years that I haven't already answered in what I have put out there in my CDs and videos and so forth. It's all, in fact, I'll even name the one. Just listen to the CD, Behold the Lamb. It's a week-long retreat. 17 one-hour lectures on gospel nonviolence. And there are no questions that aren't answered in that. But be that as it may, that's the situation as it is, Ellen. And I'm still going full steam proclaiming the gospel,
That's so good to hear.
I'm like St. Paul. You just can't stop me till you cut off my head, you know?
Well, that's good to hear because we definitely need it.
Yeah.
For sure. So
How
glad to
about
hear
you?
that you're not just sitting around eating bonbons all day.
I am not only not eating bonbons, I am not looking at Victoria's Secret or Gentleman's Quarterly to see what the latest fashions are. And this may sound like it's anti-American and anti-human even, but I do not sit around worrying about what the local tweets are from politicians.
Well, that's probably a good thing, and that kind of relates to something I'm going to ask you about politics in a couple of questions. But yeah, so
First, you want to know about pacifism versus nonviolence.
Well, if you're done with the corrections, there might have been more.
Well, there are, but I don't think that our audience would be interested in those other corrections, pronunciation, that sort of thing. And we can talk about that off camera.
Okay, sounds good.
I'm just kidding.
Oh, and I should bring up for anybody who's listening and was also tuned into episode 10, Father McNavish and I did talk a little bit about the military chaplaincy. And Father McCarthy has a great series of videos that he produced. I'll link to it in the YouTube channel, but it's on his YouTube channel, and it's on the military chaplaincy, so you can hear about that whole topic directly from Father McCarthy there. I just wanted to put a plug in for that because I really like that series of videos. Anyway, back to pacifism. What is wrong with this word pacifism? I always feel like it really bothers me when people use it to describe gospel nonviolence, because you can look up pacifism in a dictionary and find out what it means. But I really didn't understand gospel nonviolence until I seriously listened to the entire series of Behold the Lamb. It's not something that you can grasp or put into a dictionary, really. That's sort of my problem.
It can't be understood in a soundbite. And it's not taught in most seminaries, Catholic, Protestant, or Orthodox, systematically. There may be an occasional reference to Martin Luther King or Dorothy Day, but as far as a systematic presentation, theological presentation of gospel nonviolence, in the normal way that systematic presentations are made in theology, you start with God and creation and then the fall and redemption and so forth, None of that's done. That's the only place you can find that is in my tapes. I keep saying tapes. Gives my age away, in my CDs, which are on MP4s for free on my websites. But be that as it may, here's the problem. The problem is that there is a near universal, total, and I mean total, ignorance about the nonviolent Jesus of the Gospels and his way of nonviolent love of friends and enemies, because for at least 1,700 years, not only has that understanding of Jesus, which is factually based in the Gospels, not taught in the churches, Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, Evangelical, but in the churches, there has been, as there is now, a not just an avoidance of it, a demeaning of it, a placing of it in a category as something that's weird, unrealistic, utopian. It's something that through the churches, through all the churches, is negatively rejected de facto, if not de jure. That is, this is the way they handle it. They may technically say, "Oh yeah, that's what the gospel says," but we're not listening to the gospel. We're going to go with Cicero's just war theory. So that being said, that you're dealing here with something that is monstrously misrepresented in the churches, when it's misrepresented at all, because for a large part, it is simply bracketed out of any normal presentation of Christianity in any of the churches of Christianity. So, with that in mind, the ignorance of the whole phenomena of gospel nonviolence in mind in the churches, which means among Christian people, approximately 2 billion of them, at least as of right now, and billions before that. Here's the difference between pacifism and nonviolence. The word pacifism is not equivalent to the word nonviolence. Pacifism is a word that first came into existence, can first be found in a French dictionary in 1880. Pacifism as an English word can first be found in the Oxford English Dictionary in 1910. Pacifism means the rejection of the absolute rejection of war, the refusal to participate in war because, according to some moral standard, you may be an atheist, a Hindu, a Christian, a Muslim, a Jew, because of whatever moral standard you have, you find that war is not good. It is bad. It is all right. That being the case, pacifism is the absolute rejection of war. Gospel nonviolence is not about the absolute rejection of war. It's about the absolute rejection of all violence. And therein lies the big difference. It is the absolute rejection of all violence, not because my philosophy, that is my way of reasoning as I look out at the world from my limited perspective, says all violence is bad. It is the absolute rejection of all violence and enmity because God says so. Where does God say so? God said so when God became a human being in Jesus Christ, and that is unequivocally, unmistakably, unambiguously what Jesus taught by his words and by his deeds unto death. That is, he taught and lived the way of nonviolent love of friends and enemies. Therefore, all forms of violence, not just war, but capital punishment, abortion, we go on, all those forms of violence, torture, so forth, assassination, all those forms of violence are rejected by the gospel. And I would even go on to say, with the same level of certainty, that when one delves into what Jesus teaches, a way of nonviolent love of friends and enemies, as the way of God, as the reality of God, I would go on to say that includes even the violence of silence. That is, I'm sure you know and your listeners know, there is a way of hurting people, hurting them deeply, maybe wounding them for life by the way you're silent towards them. Violence, treating a person as a thing. That's what comes from the word violate. That's what violate means, to treat a person as a thing. And we can treat a person as a thing. That is, we can hurt them. We can harm them. We can do damage to them. Now, this is intentionally, not accidentally. Intentionally, by what we say, and even by what we don't say. So, for example, it is probably true that more people have been hurt, badly hurt, harmed by the tongue than by the gun. And that goes on all day, every day. And hurting people by the tongue is as normalized as hurting people by the gun. All you have to do is look on the television any day of the week, and all you hear is hurting people in the sitcoms and the talk shows. In the I remember way back. In fact, we're right on top of the anniversary of 9/11 back in 2001. I remember that there was a within a few hours, couple of hours, there was a obviously a trumped up video put on national television on all the networks with commentary. And the trumped up video was of Palestinians rejoicing in the streets of Palestine when they found out that the Twin Towers had been demolished. And I remember on that day, a national, really international radio broadcaster by the name of Howard Stearns on Cyrus. He got on the radio and he said, these Palestinians ought to be nuked. They're nothing but garbage. It's all there. It's on the internet and everything else. They're nothing but dogs. Their hospitals should be bombed. Their schools should be bombed. Well, that's an extreme, but he said it. Now it turns out that the video was a fixed video. It wasn't the Palestinian people on that day dancing in the streets. It was old footage of Palestinian people at some festival dancing, which the networks picked up and put on there as Palestinian people dancing in the street with the commentary, not just of Howard Stern, but of all kinds of other national and cable network people condemning the Palestinians. Now, how much hurt was done to Palestinian people, to Arab people, by just the word? By just the word. I raise that because you know and I know that, say, within a family, especially where there's love between people, a word can be devastatingly painful and hurting. Indeed, it can it has driven people to suicide. Just a word or two. The word can be an instrument of violence, as the gun can be an instrument of violence.
And didn't Jesus, I think that's what he was trying to say when he said, you have heard it said of old, thou shalt not kill. But I say unto you that anyone who is angry with his brother is liable to judgment. And then he goes on to say, and anybody who basically calls somebody a name, who calls somebody...
Yeah, a fool, raka. Yeah, a fool.
A fool, raka.
A fool, yeah.
Yeah, is also liable to judgment. So it's like our Lord is telling us, like, it's not just about the physical violence, that it kind of starts with the words too, and the anger that's in your heart. And it seems to me that he's raising the bar there, where he's saying it's not just about physical violence. It's also about, the violence of words, which is what you're saying.
You bet Jesus raises the bar, and every place he raises the bar is where the churches go out and try to find loopholes, and have for 1,700 years. So, for example, the first word out of Jesus' mouth in his public ministry is metanoia. That's the Greek word. We translate it repentance, but the literal translation of it is change your mind. So when Jesus is talking, and he is talking in Greek, and because that's the language of the area they lived in, along with Aramaic, and he says metanoia, he means change your mind. Now, why is that so important? That's the first word out of his mouth in the Gospel of Matthew. Change your mind. Why? Because, Ellen, the difference between a machine gun as a lethal instrument and a machine gun as just a inert piece of material is not in the thing itself. It's not in the five fingers that pull the trigger. The difference between a machine gun being an instrument of lethality and a machine gun being just an inert piece of matter is in the human mind. A machine gun without the will to kill, a machine gun in the hands of someone without the will to kill, is as impotent as a broomstick. But a broomstick in the hand of someone with the will to kill can be a lethal instrument. And it's that spirit that Jesus is talking to, not as a law, but as the internal spirit of God in the person, the Holy Spirit in the person. It's when that spirit is walked away from, the spirit that moves Jesus, the spirit that is Jesus, when that spirit is walked away from on the inside and replaced by another spirit, for example, the spirit of revenge, the spirit of hate, the spirit of anger, when that's replaced by, when the Holy Spirit of Jesus is replaced by one of those other spirits, then everything becomes dangerous. A fork becomes dangerous, on and on. But when that Holy Spirit of Jesus is there, made visible in his person and in his words, then violence, whether it be of silence, whether it be of the word, whether it be of a lethal instrument, a rock or a nuclear weapon, is impossible. And therefore, what we've done is, as far as Christians are concerned, as far as the churches are concerned, we've nurtured people for 1,700 years to believe that you can abandon the spirit of Christ and you can put on the spirit of revenge, retaliation, hate, violence, torture, and still be following Christ. We've done that in two ways. One, first by saying that the spirit of mercilessness and torture and violence and hate and anger are the same thing as the spirit of Christ. Or we've said, yet no, they're not the same thing, but we've worked out libraries full of books telling us why we can abandon the spirit of Christ in this situation, in that situation, in that situation, and so forth and so on. There is nothing in the gospel, nothing, not a word by Jesus in the gospels that allows for the abandonment of the Holy Spirit, his spirit, and the abandonment of the behavior that would follow from that allows for an exception here, an exception there, or the Russians are coming, or whatever it is. And so, pacifism is about the rejection of all war. You can reject all war and still be in favor of capital punishment, still be in favor of abortion. We all know plenty of people like that. You can still be in favor and think it normal to hurt people with words or with silence. That's pacifism. It's just the rejection of war. Gospel nonviolence is the imitation of Christ, the nonviolent Christ of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and living in his way and spirit of nonviolent love of friends and enemies, 24/7, 365, until they close the casket over you.
Thank you for that. And I was just thinking too, when you were talking that, just rejecting war on its own isn't necessarily, you said this to me once before, isn't necessarily a good thing. It depends on why you're doing it. And I think you quoted from the play Murder in the Cathedral. It was a really good quote. I'm trying to remember it. Oh, well, The Greatest Treason. Do you remember?
Okay, from Murder in the Cathedral, T.S. Eliot's Murder in the Cathedral.
Yeah.
St. Thomas of Becket.
Yes.
He knows the people are coming to kill him, And he goes through 4 temptations about whether he should run or stay or what he should do, And he's trying to weigh them all against his understanding of the gospel and Jesus. And he overcomes all the temptations, fear and so forth and so on. And then he comes to the last one. And he says, and the last of these is the greatest treason, to do the right thing for the wrong reason. Now, in Christianity, we know, every Christian knows, there's only one reason to do anything, and that is to love as Christ loved. St. Paul, in his famous paragraph in 1 Corinthians 13, if I have all the eloquence of men or angels, but speak without love, I'm a gong booming or a cymbal clashing. If I have faith to move mountains, but am without love, it's nothing at all. If I give away all that I have, piece by piece, and even if I let my body take my body to be burnt, without love, it will do me no good whatsoever. 3 things last: faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of these is love. Love is the motivation, has to be the motivation for every Christian, for every act of the Christian. Not love of, not the love of Rambo, like Rambo puts it out there. Not in his spirit, not in the spirit of Mae West, but whatever, Hollywood. But love as Jesus loves. Now, why is that important? Well, that's important because Jesus is the incarnation of God. He is God made flesh. That's what it says in the Gospel of John. And therefore, the love that he teaches and lives is divine love, is the love that God is. And that is the love that's the basis of the structure of the entire universe. And that is the love that we're made for, made from, and we're made to go into for eternity. So to love as I have loved is not the same thing, but Jesus saying it is not the same thing as Freud saying love as I have loved, or Jung, or Aristotle, because they're mere human beings. This is God, the Word of God, speaking and telling us, here is the love that moves the universe. Here is the basis of all order, everything that's good in the universe. This is what you're made of and made for and made to become. And therefore, this has to be the motivation, the right reason, the only right reason for the Christian. And that love, as modeled by Jesus, as lived by Jesus, as taught by Jesus, is a nonviolent love of friends and enemies in the Gospels.
Yeah, and you also talk a lot about the passage, in the scene in the garden when Jesus tells Peter, "Put down thy sword, for those who live by the sword die by the sword." And going back to this conversation about the motivation behind why you would do something, I hear 2 kind of common explanations for what people think that means. The first one is that it's almost like Jesus expressing his view of karma. Like, you should put down the sword because what goes around comes around. And so you wouldn't want that to come back around to you. So put down the sword. And then the second interpretation that I hear a lot of that motivation behind it, I guess it's closely related to the first one, but it seems like it has more to do with self-preservation. Like Jesus is trying to give us some good counsel so that we can preserve our own lives a bit longer. And I hear that a lot, and I don't think that's what Jesus was saying. I don't think it was Jesus's way of expressing karma. I think there's probably something more to it. So I thought maybe you could expound on that passage, because I know you bring that up a lot, the fact that he tells Peter to put down his sword. What do you think he meant when he said those who live by the sword die by the sword?
Well, obviously, Alan, he meant that people who live by the sword, die by the sword. Now, the fact of the matter is, there's a lot of people that live by the sword that don't die by the sword. There's millions out there. There's people who spend their whole lives living by the sword. or part of their lives living by the sword, and none of them have died by the sword. The saying scripture scholars tell us of Jesus saying, "He who lives by the sword dies by the sword," is not necessarily from the Garden of Gethsemane. Scripture scholars tell us it's placed in that context because to give it the most serious and dramatic kind of emphasis that he means what he says. So it may have been said someplace else or said many times someplace else, but the author of the gospel puts it there in order to emphasize the seriousness of the teaching. Now, at one level, those who, although it's not the proper word, those who see it as karma, the biblical word is judgment. That is that when you do evil, evil redounds on you in many ways that you don't understand, but it does redound on you. So that the person who lives by the sword, as it is universally known from the time of the Greeks and even before that in other cultures, and as is known today in everyday normal psychology and psychiatry, when you kill a human being, you kill something in yourself. There's not a policeman in the United States that if he shoots a human being, even if it's illegal and everything else, that they don't take the gun away from him instantly and send them into psychological care. Something happens when you kill a human being. And therefore, to kill a human being is always to kill something in yourself. James Michener, who wrote Tales of the South Pacific and so forth and so on, he talks about his own experience in World War II in the South Pacific. And he's brought up a Christian and so forth and so on. And he says that he was trained to kill and all that, but he never did. And then one day I guess he came face to face or some way with a Japanese person, who was a soldier, and he killed him. And he said at that instant he vomited all over himself. It was as if everything he ever been taught to be had left him. Now, interestingly enough, in the diary of Rudolf Höss, who was the commandant of Auschwitz, in his diary, he talks about the fact that he was all caught up in German nationalism during the First World War. He was only 16 years old, but he lied his way into the military. And they trained him and so forth and so on, send him to Turkey. And so here he is, he's in the trenches in Turkey, and he's fighting the British, which included the Indians, Asian Indians, Hindus, and he's just sitting there in a trench, and a Hindu comes over the top of the trench, and he has a knife, and he's going to kill him, Hindu soldier. And he fires his gun, kind of unthinkingly, and he kills him. And this is what he says. He said, at that instant, I vomited all over myself. They had to remove him from the front lines because he became paralyzed. He couldn't function. And he did go back 2 or 3 times more before he was able to really get into the killing and not have it affect him. And of course, we know in the end he was as the commandant of Auschwitz, he killed 1,600,000 people. You kill something when Jesus says, he who lives by the sword dies by the sword. One level is that you kill something in yourself when you kill others. The other level is, it seems to me, that can be talked about and should be talked about, is that to what extent Are Jesus' teachings, in fact, teachings about the way to eternal life as opposed to eternal death? For one and for all. So the question has to be asked that if Jesus is communicating the word of God as the way to eternal life for one and all, each and every one, then could it be that he who lives by the sword, that is, he who kills another human being, is endangering his eternal life, is toying with eternal death? Remember, the first sin outside paradise, sin, now we're talking sin, is Cain killing Abel. Murder, killing, homicide. Jesus, the Son of God, our Lord, he ends his life being murdered. In the Old Testament, killing people is the single largest experience presented in Hebrew Scripture in one way or another. It's not sex. It's not beauty. It's killing people. I believe, if as I remember these correctly, there are 1,652 acts of killing people in the Old Testament, including God ordering genocide of the Amalekites and God ordering other things and people doing other things. The Old Testament is pretty much the same as American television that way. I remember reading some years back that the average person, when he graduates from high school, has probably seen 18,000 murders on television, meaning portrayed, but he's into the spirit of it, the mind of it. So he who lives by the sword dies by the sword. What do we think is the What do we think is the source of this whole thing that we can go back and we name it different things at different times? You know, we named it shell shock in the First World War. In the Second World War, it was they broke down. They had a nervous breakdown. We call it PSTD now. Huh? What's that from? That is from the consequences of killing people. That's not because people are being trained to march and step or being trained how to use a gun or salute or anything. That's from killing people. PSTD is from killing people. And we don't talk about it that way.
We don't. And we never talk about, it's funny, I just put something up on the blog the other day about another report that has come out saying that the veterans in our country are the ones who are killing themselves at the highest rate. And in the article, of course, it talks about addiction and mental health issues, and completely refuse to even acknowledge the fact that of moral injury, I guess what they're calling now moral injury. But the way it was written was like, oh, these poor veterans are committing suicide because they have these mental health issues or they're addicted to drugs. No mention of the fact of what they've been through, what they've done and what they've seen people do in war, as if that would not even lend any kind of explanation to why these.
And that, not only that, and that is the thing that starts it all. The killing of a human being, participating in the killing of a human being. And that is not talked about. And we're calling these people heroes. They know they're not heroes. They know what they've done. Even if everyone has told them it's legitimate. They've seen the corpses. They've seen the head blown off of the person they are burnt to the whatever the case may be. And they know, just like Mishna knew and Rudolf Höss knew, they vomited. Not that any individual person did that, but that is the effect on the human psyche. And therefore, why won't we talk about the fact that the source of it all is that you fooled these people to go into the military by medals and marching and bands and promises of education and this, that, and the other thing. And then they got there, and then behold, all of a sudden they're into a world that they never, never, never expected. They thought it was going to be something like a movie, when in fact, when you're out there and you're in battle or whatever the case may be, and you're standing next to a guy and the next minute his stomach is blown out and you're walking on his entrails, which is the normal, I because I've been at this for over 50 years, I could tell you stories as any veteran could who was in a real war of horror scenes of what they had to live through in order to just live, in terms of their own buddies being killed and destroyed, and in terms of them killing and destroying people, and then seeing the consequences of their acts. Remember, what we're talking about here is people who they're just normal like you and I. They weren't brought up, oh, they may be tough guys or they may be wimps or something. But when they get in the military, the whole process is a process, to use a word we've just used, of metanoia, of changing the minds and changing the brains of the people that come in by a systematic set of psychological processes, so that they become inured to killing. Indeed, that they like it. And so I've watched these Marine or other training films, and where the DI, the sergeant, is up there telling them that we're going to send these gooks home to their mother in a body bag, and they all cheer. Or you've got 50 or 60 young people with guns raised in the air, yelling, "Kill, kill, kill." That's metanoia. It's the metanoia of evil. It's not the metanoia of Jesus. It's the inculcation of the spirit of homicide and violence and enmity. It's not the inculcation of the spirit of Jesus. And I think, Ellen, what we have to do is, where in the name of God are the bishops, the popes, the priests, the ministers, the pastors, letting children go in, because that's what they are at 18, 19 years old compared to the military juggernaut, letting children go in to have their minds destroyed like this, letting them go in before their minds are even possibly fully developed, which doesn't happen till 24. They don't know what they're going into, and they're being led into destruction. Destruction is totally contrary to the gospel, made into beings totally contrary to the being that Jesus wants them made into, being led into satanic metanoia as opposed to Christ-like metanoia. And the silence of the bishops, the popes, the patriarchs, the pastors, the deacons, on and on, the priest, it is an abomination, and they've been doing it for 1,700 years. And their silence is violence. It's evil.
So why do you think, when I was talking to Father McNavish too, I asked him, when you were in seminary for 7 years, how many days did you spend studying, this issue of war and peace, but, Gospel Nonviolence, the teachings of Jesus on violence. And he said he never got any kind of systematic presentation of Gospel Nonviolence at all. He had never heard of that until he came to your retreat. And what mention there was of it was couched in this term pacifism, which is very limited, as we've discussed already. And then he said he spent about 5 afternoons talking about just war theory. So what are your thoughts, Father McCarthy? Is it just that it's so it's been so submerged for so long that it's like people don't know it's there? Or is it more of like I hate to use the word, but like a conspiracy, like an intentional effort to suppress this aspect of our faith? Do you think it's intentional, like an organized thing? I'll give you an example. I was reading the Magnificat. This is just one of 1,000 examples I see every year of this kind of thing. I was reading the Magnificat, and it was the feast day of Saint Martin of Tours, and there's always a little bit of an explanation about the saint. And I will never forget, this is when I was listening to Behold the Lamb. And it said that St. Martin of Tours was a soldier who saw a poor man on the side of the road and gave him his cloak. And so he was a symbol of charity. There's a whole other story.
My God. Yeah.
About St. Martin of Tours that was not even mentioned in the Magnificat, which is that he was, I believe, one of the very first conscientious objectors.
That's right.
So this is what I'm talking about. Like, the people who wrote the Magnificat, do you think they just didn't know? Or is it something that is kind of intentionally shoved into the shadows so it can't really enter our consciousness? This is what I want to know.
Cardinal John Wright, at the time, in the 1970s, was the highest ranking American cardinal in the Vatican. A brilliant man, absolutely brilliant. He told Gordon Zahn, a friend of mine who was an author and a psychologist, a sociologist, etc. He told Gordon Zahn, in all his Catholic education, which went all the way to a doctorate in Rome, he had one 45-minute course on war and nothing on nonviolence. Bishop Thomas Gumbleton, now retired from Detroit, in a very, very impressive documentary on George Zabelko, who was the Catholic chaplain of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bomb crew. Bishop Gumbleton says in that video, he went through 21 consecutive years of Catholic education, all the way to a doctorate, and never heard the word nonviolence. I can attest, when I was at Notre Dame in the 1950s as a student, my book on moral theology was called Christian Virtues, written by a person with a doctorate in moral theology, Charles Sheedy, who was also the dean of the Arts and Letters School at Notre Dame. And in that book, it says specifically, a Catholic cannot be a pacifist. And that's got an imprimatur on it. Now, what we're talking about here, and of course, when I grew up, I mean, the only relation to pacifism I knew was just this is in the 40s and the 50s. The only relation to pacifism I knew that the word even referenced to in my life had nothing to do with Catholic. It had to do with a heretical sect called Quakers, who, by the way, were understood to be wimps, cowards, didn't love their country. That's all I got all my life. I went through 21 years of Catholic education to a doctorate and never heard anything about it. So the question is why? Now I'll let your audience answer it as they wish to answer it. But does it seem like a teaching that, by the way, the church officially endorses? That is, you can be a Catholic in full communion with the Catholic Church, and believe Jesus' teachings are teachings of nonviolent love of friends and enemies, and live that. Believe that Jesus was nonviolent and live that. Believe that God is nonviolent and live that. For example, Dorothy Day, Mother Teresa. There's a couple of examples, just to mention hundreds. And you can, so it's a teaching acceptable in the church. In fact, it's the original teaching of the church for the first 300 years. And so why isn't it that teaching, which was the predominant teaching, in fact, let me add one thing, not the predominant teaching for 300 years. There's a conservative Catholic writer by the name of George Wiegel. And he's given all kinds of space in Catholic papers and Catholic newspapers and everything Catholic he got access to. They give it to him. Now, George Wiegel, just parenthetically, was one of the 29 original signers of the program for a new American century. That's the program that said we need a new Pearl Harbor to implement all these changes in military and public policy and public civil rights and so forth. Without the new Pearl Harbor, we can't have it. He was one of the original signers, along with along with Cheney and Rumsfeld and others.
And that was pre 9/11.
That's pre 9/11. That's 1995.
And they said we would need a new Pearl Harbor in order to accomplish the goal of invading Iraq.
It's all there on the computer under Program for a New American Century. The names are there. Everything's there. The whole there's books written on it, and so forth and so on. But that is what they understood. They understood what they were proposing. If America was going to be an empire in the 21st century, was that the people would not tolerate the changes that were necessary to do that unless there was, and these are their words, a new Pearl Harbor, which, of course, came about on September 11th, 2001, when Cheney and Rumsfeld and all those people were, in fact, in office as Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, etc. But anyway, getting back to George Weigel, I don't care much about politics. Getting back to George Weigel, he wrote, I don't know, about a 340-page book justifying Christian violence. Tranquillus, I forget the whole name. It's a Latin title, Tranquillus something. It's in English, though. 340 pages. And he starts his whole discussion off with no reference to the first 300 years of Christianity. He starts it off with the just war theory. A Yale church historian, and gosh, I just missed his name. I'll think about it as we want. He wrote a book in which he documented that there is not one single document in the church from the first 300 years that justifies Christians going to war. They all say no. Now, how can you leave the first 300 years, the 300 years closest to Jesus, the 300 years when people knew the gospel as well as we did, maybe better because they spoke Greek, and that's what the language the gospel is. How can you leave that out of a book on war? How can the church leave that out in their teaching of children from kindergarten on through doctorates? How is it possible? Unless it's planned. Unless it's planned. And it is planned. All over the world, this is intentionally kept out of consciousness. As it is kept out of consciousness of Catholic men who go in the military. The military chaplain, now, I'm a priest. Military Catholic chaplains are priests, for the most part. They're priests. If I would apply to be a military chaplain, assuming which is not possible now because of age, I would be rejected. Not because when I was, whatever it was, 35 years old, or 40, or whatever it was, not because I wasn't physically fit. Those days, I was as physically fit as a decathlon champion. But I would be rejected for one reason only. Not because I didn't have the degrees. Not because I wasn't a priest in good chin. I would be rejected as a chaplain for the United States military for one reason only. I was a pacifist. A priest who is that is meaning the nonviolence, not pacifism that way, huh? But that would be their word, pacifism. A priest who does not espouse the just war theory and teach it cannot be a military chaplain. Who says so? If a person can be a priest and espouse nonviolence, if a person can be a priest and reject war totally, then who is saying that a person who is to be a military chaplain a priest, can't reject war totally and the government? And the church accedes to it. Our priest will not teach what is part of the Orthodox Catholic tradition. The first 300 years, historically valid, the first 300 years of Christianity, and which is still part of the Orthodox tradition, although a minor tradition at this point, We accede to the government, and we will not appoint any priests, military chaplains who teach that. Now, I tell you, if you listen to my CDs and stuff, I teach just war theory. Even though I don't believe in it, I don't think it's right. I think it's wrong. I think it's evil. I think it's illogical. I think it's as phony as a unicorn. But I teach it because I'm a priest. And this is part of the Catholic tradition. After I teach it, just like when I teach Gospel Nonviolence, people can do with it what they will, Catholics. But my responsibility as a priest, as every bishop's responsibility is, to teach what the church teaches, even as an option. And so, suppose I'm a bishop. Suppose I'm a bishop or a priest. And I really like 4 of the 7 sacraments. But you know the ones I don't like? I don't like confession. I don't like that one, so I'm not going to teach about it. I'm not, I have my questions about whether marriage is even a sacrament or it's just, I know the history of it and so forth, matrimony. I don't think I'll teach that one. It's too ambiguous historically. Can I do that? I can't. No, I have to teach all 7 sacraments. I can't leave out 4 of them or 3 of them because of my likes or dislikes. How then can the bishops of the United States, the bishops of the world, leave out Gospel Nonviolence, which is an authentic, original, valid, traditional, Catholic, Orthodox teaching, because they don't like it? And the reason is because governments want them to leave it out. It would be the biggest interference with war in the Western world that we could imagine. If Catholics, Orthodox, and Protestant churches started laying out there, just started laying out there from the cradle onward, from the pulpit, religious education, not doing away with the just war, but just putting out there the gospel basis and Jesus' teachings in the gospel, and why, because it's the word of God, it's God's will, it's important. I'm not saying it would end war, but what a dent it would make. It'd be incredible. But they're not going to do it, because if they do it, to use something that the biblical scholar John L. Mackenzie said in his writing called The Civilization of Christianity, if the Catholic Church today were to begin to teach what the Mennonites teach, their wonderful relationship with government would end tomorrow.
Yeah,
that's the problem. So you ask, is this non-teaching of nonviolence? Is this something that is accidental, or is it intentional? At this point, it's intentional. I remember talking to a biblical scholar who was a consultant to the United States Catholic bishops. And he said to me, maybe this was 25, 30 years ago. He said to me, at least by the middle 1970s, every Catholic bishop in the United States knew that Jesus of the gospel was nonviolent, and his teachings were teachings of nonviolence. I don't know bishops, I don't know, but that's what he said to me. 30 years ago, he said that to me. But they do not permit it to be taught. And they load up on the other side. They load up Catholic schools from grade school to kindergarten to high school to colleges with military paraphernalia and shrines and all kinds of things. My own high school just opened a shrine to those who have been in the service since 1932. What kind of stuff is that? My point is, not a word on nonviolence, and it's not being taught, and it's intentional that it's not being taught, because the bishops, I'm not saying the priest, and I'm not saying anyone else, but the bishops know Jesus' teachings are teachings of nonviolent love of friends and enemies, and they simply will not allow it to be taught as an essential piece of what the church teaches.
Okay, so while we're on this kind of topic of like conspiracy, and I don't mean that
conspiracy. Everything's a conspiracy. You and I deciding to do these podcasts is a conspiracy.
Right. Yeah.
I think that's a word we don't want to use because that's a loaded word.
It is a loaded.
This is an institutional decision that was made by the Catholic Church long, long ago, and that most of the Protestant churches have picked up on, and Orthodox Church. And it's an institutional decision to squash certain teachings of Jesus, in this case here, his teachings of nonviolent love of friends and enemies, as obligatory and make it optional, and then not to even teach it as optional.
Got it. So an institutional decision. I guess while we're on this train of thought, and you don't have to answer this if it's just you don't want to go there. And I remember talking to you about this once before. Just thinking about these coincidences, the Project for a New American Century, George Wiegel, who then what became this kind of in my opinion, a propagandist for the war. We invaded, so especially since 9/11 is happening tomorrow, I didn't even realize that until you brought it up. But so we invaded, 9/11 happened in 2001, and we invaded Afghanistan shortly thereafter. The Boston Globe released their report that exposed the sex abuse scandal in the church in January of 2002. To me, I don't know if that seems entirely coincidental considering how silent the church has been. Now, part of me, I don't know, I'm just running this by you, but part of me feels like, okay, maybe the church is just so distracted with dealing with the fallout and the finances and trying to protect their assets that they haven't had a chance to speak out against these wars for 20 years. But the other side of me wonders if it was more than just a coincidence. Would you like to weigh in on that at all?
Yeah, sure. Now, just want to make sure that what I'm speaking now is not church doctrine or anything. What I said before was consistent with what I think is the teaching of the Catholic Church. What is the teaching of the Catholic Church? This is opinion.
Yes. Opinion.
Just the opinion. Someone's been around for 78 years or so as a Catholic and who is and knows a little bit about the internal workings of politics in the church and in the government and so forth. On March 20th, 2003 was when the United States officially, if you will, started the tearing apart of the Middle East, bombing Iran and so forth in Baghdad, and that was implemented by George Bush. What are you going to say? That was implemented by Cheney and Rumsfeld and Abrams and Scooter Libby and all those people who signed the document for the program for a New American Century. Now, one bishop out of approximately 300 bishops came out and said, you can't go to war like that. This is an immoral war. Immoral on the basis of the teaching of Jesus, and it does not in any way meet the standards of the just war theory. It's an invasion, etc., etc. One bishop, Bishop John Botein, a Romanian Catholic bishop of the United States and Canada. That's all. After that, silence, dead silence for 16 years on the part of the American bishops. 16 years of silence. Now, it would be one thing if they weren't participating in the war. But to justify a reality is to promote a reality, is to participate in the reality. And I don't know how morally they do this. I'm sure they've worked it out among themselves of what the strategy is. But if the bishops, like the Pope did, Pope John Paul II did before the war started, if they laid out that this was not a just war, and it did not meet the teachings of Jesus or even the minimal standards of the just war theory, diocese by diocese, and they said to the people, this is not a just war, and if it's not a just war, the killing is unjustified. Unjustified killing is murder. When you kill in this war, you're doing the same thing as when you have an abortion. Unjustified killing, taking of a human life. If they had said that, the war would have been over long ago.
I think
probably couldn't even get started, because they may have said it on March 20th or right after that, but the whole consciousness would grow about what's going on over there, and basically more and more people would begin to fit the facts into the just war theory. But Ellen, I would say there is not one Catholic, I'm going to be extreme now, but I don't think it's extreme. I don't think there's one Catholic in the United States who knows the just war theory. 1 out of 50,000. Because I know my information is anecdotal, but I've asked hundreds and hundreds of Catholics, what are the standards of the just war theory? What are the governing principles? A moral theology that governs the just war theory. Well, it says this. Basically, the answer is, well, the Catechism says we have a just war, therefore just war. No. The Catechism says that the standards of the just war theory have to be, and this is the Catechism's word, strictly adhered to. But if you don't know the standards, how can you strictly adhere to them? And if they're not taught by the military chaplaincy, how can you strictly adhere to them in war? And if they're not taught by the local parish priest, the religious educator, or the bishop, how can you possibly strictly adhere to them? You see, suppose I was a Catholic chaplain in a secular hospital where they performed abortions. And let's say it was also a teaching hospital. It was connected to a medical school, and they were taught abortions. With the Catholic people in the hospital, at my masses, at my spiritual discussions, religious education, for the people who worked in the hospital, would I just remain silent and say, go do what you want? Do what the hospital tells you to do? That's crazy. No, I would not. But where war is concerned, and the church's institutional relationship with the state and its money is concerned, then dead silence for 16 years. And remember now, they are not outside of the killing responsibility, although they may see themselves outside of it. It's beyond me how they can. Responsibility for the deaths over in the Middle East and the deaths of the American boys here and girls, because approximately a third to 50% or 40% of the soldiers and the Marines and the Navy people and what have you that have gone over there and done the killing are Catholics. They're from Catholic parishes and Catholic dioceses, and they have not been taught. They have not, they've been denied knowledge, not only of Jesus' teachings of nonviolent love of friends and enemies, they have been denied explicit knowledge of the Catholic just war theory, even when they're about to go into the military, and even in the military.
Yes, and I guess what I was kind of asking, though, was more about the timing of the big explosion of this investigative reporting that unleashed, the sex scandal crisis that has basically consumed the Catholic Church in the United States for the past 16 years. like, it just seems a little bit coincidental that that happened right around the launch of this war. It almost seems like, I mean, to me, I don't know, maybe I'm just jaded, but I feel like people out there probably knew this was going on. And it was just a matter of timing the release of the information in such a way that would cripple the church, even just in terms of what its concerns were. Like, instead of the war, it acted as like a big distraction. And now we have entire Catholic independent news outlets that have sort of been created. And I'm thinking of like Church Militant, and like they do a lot of good work in exposing, you know, the truth behind what's been going on. But it's like they're consumed with that instead of talking about the 16-year-long war. And I don't know, is that coincidence?
No. It's not coincidence. Ellen, do you mean to tell me that the sophisticated intelligence operations of the United States and Britain and France and Russia and Israel did not know the pedophilia that was going on in the Catholic Church for decades or centuries? Of course they did. Of course they did. They know everything. They know everything. And they knew the church knew it. And they knew that the modus operandi was just to move priests around, which, just parenthetically, as late as 1988, psychology books were still being published, secular psychology, saying that pedophilia was not that damaging. So, but they knew, there's no way governments didn't know of the enormity of the pedophilia that was going on in the Catholic Church.
Which I also think we are now discovering is also goes on in the government. That's all coming out.
Absolutely, absolutely. It goes on New York school system. It goes on, you know, on and on and on. That pedophilia is a. It's just a terrible universal problem and has been for ages unto ages in the past. Children of
used for blackmail and things like
that.
that.
Absolutely. It's used every way. But remember, just if you've ever looked at the movie, which goes back to the Globe story called Spotlight, it's pretty good. It's pretty accurate. And Spotlight was the Spotlight team of the Boston Globe that revealed this. What takes place is the New York Times buys the Boston Globe, 100% ownership. Then it changes the editor of the Boston Globe to a guy that comes in by the name of Marty Barons. And he orders the Spotlight team soon after being there to investigate this problem. The Spotlight team had never thought of doing this. And they actually, if the movie is right and the book is right, they actually kind of step back from wanting to do it. But he was the editor-in-chief, and he insisted that they do it. The guy appointed by the New York Times. And so they begin the process. It is really an expensive process. The key to getting the information that was necessary was that the Boston Globe, remembering that's a subsidiary of the New York Times, had to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to get at, through the court system and appeal system and so forth, to get at the secret archives of the Catholic Church, which were always thought to that point as simply being invulnerable. You can't go there with this. You cannot access the private conversation between a bishop and the priest on matters of conscience. Not confessional, that is. Well, anyway, after spending all that money, and then they come out with on, and then it's picked up, and last week, so this is 2019, and that's in 2002, January 2002, that Spotlight thing came out. So this is 17 years later, and the Boston Globe, this past week or the week before that, had a story about a priest in the Philippines who was engaged in pedophilia. Of all the stories in the world to put in a paper, What's that doing in there? Of all the things that are going on, what's that doing in there? No. I think the pedophilia thing to the Catholic bishops was by the secular world. Remember, the New York Times and the New York Times is just a subsidiary of the government, and the government subsidiary of the New York Times, whatever you want to call it. These are the elites. It was a warning shot over the bow of the Catholic Church. To be clever, it was a warning shot over the bow of the bark of Peter. And therefore, the warning shot was, this is only the tip of what we can do. Spend your time on this, blah, blah, blah. Don't you think they knew about bishops as well as priests? Of course they did. The CIA, NSA, Mossad, MM16, they knew it. They knew it for as long as it's been going on. It's just when you release it and for what purpose. And the purpose was, this was a shot over the bow of the bark of Peter, and it shut them all up. Because,
sure did.
Because they knew that governments and their intelligence services had a lot of other stuff beyond the sexual pedophilia if they wanted to really throw things out there that would discredit the church. I would say, for example, to use an example, the use of money, which is in all the churches, not just Catholic, but Catholic is the big one, huh? The use of money, I think there'd be scandals that would call for an end to, which may not be a bad thing, the nonprofit status of churches. But be that as it may, Ellen, back in 1936, on November 9, 1935, I probably got the date wrong. I know it's November 9th. I can't remember the exact year. Maybe 33. But anyway, I think it was 33. Anyway, Hitler has just become chancellor, which is basically sole ruler of Germany at that point. But he's still in the context of a balance of power thing with the legislature and so forth. And lo and behold, what happens? The Reichstag burns down. The whole Reichstag burns down. This massive building burns down overnight on November 9th. And of course, Hitler's right up there on the front saying, blame the communists, you know. Sounds like blame the Arabs. And then what happens after that? People want to give up freedom for security, and they demand that Hitler have dictatorial powers.
Father, do you think...
now just let me add one thing to that.
Sure.
9/11 had the same effect as the Reichstag burning. That is, it changed civil society, military society, consciousness, and put in place a totally different way of thinking about life. Now, that being the case, and we know it, everyone says, well, that was before 9/11, you can't... That being the case, Ellen, it seems to me that we always got to ask the question, who profits from an event? Who profits? Theoretically, we can look and say the cause was the communists, the cause was, Osama bin Laden, the cause was... But look at who profits from a catastrophic event. And that's where you go to find out who caused the catastrophic event. And by profits, we mean profit politically, profit in terms of control of finance and government, profit in terms of raw profit. Look, and that'll tell you a great deal. Now, the bishops of the United States, of course, are CEOs of, all of them are CEOs of multi-million-dollar corporations, church, dioceses. Some of them, I suspect, they go into the billions. Of course they do. They got to watch out for these things. They got to take care of these things. And they also know they have a lot of skeletons in the closet, as we all do. Everyone has a past. But so what they do is they simply tame the gospel down, tame it down to protect the institutional's wealth and political power and so forth. Can you imagine after every the bishops meet semi-annually, and the second of their meetings in the fall is at the Marriott Hotel in Baltimore, and it's surrounded with guards and blah, 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 blah. But the point is, every Tuesday night of that meeting, the United States military puts on a banquet for the bishops, and they accept. No, we're not talking about when something big happens, it's not an accident. And I guess the problem is that the problem that I have with it all is I could care less about the politics. But my concern is the salvation of souls. When you withhold critical information from your flock, information they need to know, because this is a moral problem of their time, you are doing something evil. You are doing something evil. And therefore, yes, I think there is a relationship. And by the way, one final little parenthesis here. There is no greater form of child abuse and child sexual abuse that occurs in war. Children are the fundamental and overwhelming victims of war universally. And that doesn't just mean death and suffering. It means sexual abuse and slavery and all kinds of other things.
Father, didn't you try to put up a video recently with an image from Hiroshima of the child running, from who had been scarred by the bomb? And didn't YouTube take it down because it violated the child protection policy or something? I just thought that was so bizarre and ironic.
Yes, YouTube took this video down. It was called the Pietà, Mother of Sorrows. It was 9 minutes. And it was about the fact that the Blessed Mother with Jesus in her arms, that's the Pietà, the child in the arms of the mother, the dead child, that the Blessed Mother in that situation was simply living what thousands and millions and tens of millions and hundreds of millions of other mothers had lived in the context of state, government, military violence. That is the dead child in the arms of the mother, and the mother just agonizing, or the father for that matter, over what they're seeing. So I opened the video up with and I know this probably your audience doesn't know this, but I opened the video up with the most famous picture from the Vietnam War, which is the little 9-year-old girl running out of a flaming village that had just been napalmed from the sky. Her skin burned off, naked, her skin burned off, other children behind her with their skin burned off, and she's screeching, yelling in pain, and that was the picture that was taken. It was all over the press, all world press, 2 or 3 days later, and it was selected as one of the 100 most iconographic images of the 20th century. We know the little girl's name now. It was Kim Phuc, Phuc. She lives in Canada now, but her body was just scorched. The skin was falling off. And then the next picture that's there. But what your audience I'm sure your audience have all seen that famous picture from Vietnam, 1968. But what your audience probably did not know was there was an Australian photographer that is taking video of that same event. Exactly the same event. The children running towards the American soldiers with the flaming city or town in back, and other adults too running away from the napalming. And that video, it's only a short little thing that he had, only a short little thing he recorded, maybe a minute or less. I included that video, that actual video with the picture, and with the picture of the Blessed Mother with the baby Jesus, not the baby Jesus, but the dead body of Christ in her arms. And then in that video is Kim Fox's grandmother. And she is running out, and she's got a baby in her arms, and you see the skin falling off the baby. The baby looks like it may be 2 years old. And then I went on, and the theme is the uniting of the Pieta, the uniting of the Pieta, the suffering of the Blessed Mother, holding the dead body of Christ in her arms, as she would have on Calvary, because she was there. And human mothers all over the world, at all times and places during, not in Iraq and other places, in America, the body of their loved one, just put their arms wrapped around the loved one. And the video concludes with a little excerpt from Mel Gibson's The Passion. The excerpt is about Mary holding Jesus in her arms in agony. And the very conclusion of the video is a call, a cry, a plea to mothers all over the world not to bring up their sons and not allow their sons and daughters to be brought up to kill other people's precious children. 9 minutes. It's short. You can still find it on Vimeo and other places. And it was up for about 5-6 years, just sitting there. Didn't get many hits or anything like that. A few hundred, I think, not many. But YouTube sent a notice, big black notice, that they were taking it down because it violated community standards. An appeal was made, and they send back a robot letter, one sentence, your appeal has been read, and we're still going to take it down. Now, a great deal of what that is all about, staying with our topic that we're dealing with here, is keeping the consciousness of what war really is out of the minds of ordinary people. There is no such thing as killing one person in war, regardless of who you are, which side. When you kill someone, you kill something in yourself, and you kill something in the people who love that person. The darkest of all human experiences is the dead, mutilated body in the arms of someone that loved him or her. And that's what goes on in war, day in, day out, these past 16 years in the Middle East and in America, and on back, is the destruction of love and the anguish and agony. So we do body counts. In fact, this war, we don't even do body counts. They're not even worth counting. So Tommy Franks said, we don't do body counts. In the original Iraq War in 91, Colin Powell says, we'll just cut them off and kill them. Who? Every one of the persons who were killed, American, Iranian, Afghani, they have people that love them. And you're destroying them as well as the other person. As it is so also. When someone is brought home to America, Hmm? The parents, the wives, the children. It's torture. It's agony. Dead body. And we give them a medal, or we give them a ribbon or something like that. We give them a flag. Okay. They can live. That's a myth. That's all a myth. That has nothing to do with eternal life. That just is a myth about protecting the country. But be that as it may, the agony doesn't subside with that. And so YouTube found it to be 9 minutes, nothing but a religious theme, religious music behind it, music about Jesus, and just they found it to be against community standards. So it's not, Jesus doesn't need YouTube to spread the gospel. That's crazy. We don't need that. I don't need YouTube. Jesus doesn't need YouTube. I may need it, but Jesus doesn't. But think what's going on there. And that's going on every day all over the place. That is the refusal to allow knowledge to exist in the minds of ordinary people by basically a process of systematic censorship.
Right. Yeah, I like that. Jesus doesn't need YouTube. I've been thinking this podcast is getting a little depressing. Not this.
No, it shouldn't be depressing.
No, not this one in particular, but just the whole thing. Like, it's hard to kind of talk about these heavy topics all the time. So I'm kind of like ending on an up note there. Like, Jesus doesn't need YouTube. I like that. Because, yeah, you're always wondering when you're going to say something that they're going to find. I've already had one of my videos censored. It was your "What About Hitler" talk. And they said,
and let me say a word about that. They censored the video. There's a question and answer. There are normal questions and answers people ask about nonviolence. Who are interested or who come to a retreat or something like that, And they're all quite normal. Things like, what about the cleansing in the temple? What about when Jesus says, I come not to bring peace, but the sword? Huh? But one of the normal questions that is asked is, well, what about Hitler? What do you do about Hitler? That is a normal, everyday question that's asked when people finally get a sense that the Jesus nonviolence in the gospel may be right. There may be truth in it. Then they think a second, what about Hitler? So I responded to that question in 1988 on an audio disc, as well as the others, 1988. And since 1988, it's been out there. It's been there. It's been on YouTube. It's been here. It's been there. It's on Vimeo. It's on, et cetera, et cetera. That question and many others. And then a few weeks ago, whatever it was, a month ago, it's taken down because it's inconsistent with.
They said it was
hate speech. Oh, yeah, that's it. It's hate speech.
And I wrote them back and I said, I think you misunderstood. This is about nonviolence. Like, for no reason should you turn a person into a thing. Should you commit violence? And they were like, nope, we're standing by our decision.
Yeah, that's all. That's all. It's hate. This is hate speech. Look, you could, that video, or those questions and answers are on both my websites. They're all over the place. They're up there. But it's just an audio. It shouldn't say it's a video. It's an audio. Listen to it. And if this is hate speech, this is not hate speech. This is about loving your enemies. This is what Jesus teaches.
Unless they think it's like hate speech against the people who fought Hitler or something. I don't know, some twisted rationale. But I feel like that's where we're headed.
You gotta listen to it. You gotta listen. What do you, when someone asks you the question, as they do to anyone who teaches Jesus' way of nonviolent love and friends, they'll always come up and say, well, what about Hitler? And I spend 19 minutes logically, intelligently raising the issue of answering that question. It has nothing to do, the question really isn't what about Hitler? They could just as well have said, well, what about Stalin? Or they could have said, what about Osama bin Laden? Or from another angle, they could have said, what the Indians could have said, what about Churchill? He's slaughtering us, back in the 19 teens.
Right.
It's a universal question when you face nonviolence because it's tied to death, the possibility of death anyway. That's what's answered.
Right. It's there's nothing. It's ridiculous that they get away with calling it hate speech. But on that note, Father, I don't know how much more time you have left, but there were a couple of what about questions that came into the comments. I don't know if you can answer them in a short amount of time, but I could try. You could try if you're up for it, or we could just bring it up another time.
Well, what are the questions?
Okay, the first one was what about the Crusades and King Louis XIV? And the second one was what about Our Lady of Victory and the Battle of Lepanto? And then there's a couple more questions, but those are kind of the whatabouts that kind of came up.
Well, they're really not hard to answer. I don't know about the king, but certainly what I know about is all the Crusades. There's no just one of them, four of them really, maybe five. But anyway, and then the Battle of Lepanto. They're all evil. They're evil, outright evil. Nothing other than evil. That is, if evil is to be judged by what Jesus says evil is, if Jesus is to be judged by what is explicitly contrary to the word of God as revealed by Jesus, the revelation of God as God's will is revealed by Jesus, then Lepanto and the Crusades are nothing, absolutely nothing but outright evil. Period. Now, the devil never speaks more, he never speaks more convincingly than when he speaks for God. Now, Pope Pius V, who called the First Crusade, Pope Pius V, who called not the First Crusade, but called for the Battle of Lepanto and put together this holy alliance of the papal navy and so forth and so on and others. Before he was Pope, he was the Grand Inquisitor. The Grand Inquisitor. Now there's something too. What about the Inquisition? This is Christians killing Christians and non-Christians. This is Christians doing the opposite of what Jesus says is God's will, is God's way, of Jesus' way. It is evil. Absolute evil. Now, at the University of Notre Dame, they have a basilica there, which is a papal church, Sacred Heart Basilica. And when you look straight on at the altar, from the back or from the front there, you look to the left. There's a rather large stained glass window, and what's depicted in that stained glass window is the Battle of Lepanto and the Crusades. What in the name of heavens, in a Christian church right next to the sanctuary, is an image of people killing people doing there? Admittedly, Catholics are killing Muslims, Muslims are killing Catholics. What's it doing there? And what even makes it worse, Ellen, is that up in the far left-hand corner of the picture, there is a nice picture of the Blessed Mother overseeing it all. And of course, that has to do with the fact that the Grand Inquisitor, Pius V, whatever the history of it is, it said that he's had the people saying the rosary in Rome for victory. So all of a sudden, we're bringing the Blessed Mother in as a killer. It's not good enough to have Jesus supporting a killing. This is a terrible thing. So, to say something is evil, Ellen, does not mean to say that anyone who participated in has sinned. Sin and evil are two different things. Evil is doing what is contrary to the will of God as revealed by Jesus, God himself, God incarnate. Sin is when a person with full knowledge and full consent chooses to do evil. I'm telling you, the vast majority of people who have as Christians, as Catholics, Christians, who have participated in the vicious and ugly and cruel, murderous wars of nations in the Western world, have had no idea that they were engaging in sin. No idea that they were engaging in evil.
And there's a lot of people who want to keep it that way.
And there is at least one train of thought, and that is that by keeping the people in ignorance, you are actually saving them.
If you don't tell them that they're doing wrong,
tell them there's anything wrong with this. As a matter of fact, if you tell them it's good, and you support it with all the paraphernalia of liturgies and church stuff, then they think they're doing good. And of course, in the Catholic faith, primacy of conscience rules. What you think in conscience is good, and you do it, it's good. It may be objectively evil, but you have not sinned, because you don't know with full knowledge and full consent that this is evil. Now, way back, you probably, being a summa cum laude graduate from Jesuit College, BC, Boston College, you were an English major, right?
Yes.
So you probably read, assuming the Jesuits were doing their work up at BC, you probably read someplace along the line Dostoevsky's The Grand Inquisitor.
Nope. It's on my list. It's been on my list for years.
Ellen, I got to look at your baptismal certificate and make sure you're still Catholic. Yeah, I don't.
It's terrible.
Look, it is terrible, because The Grand Inquisitor is only about 10 pages in the middle of Brother Karamazov.
Oh.
But it's one of the most famous pieces of literature in the world. And what it is, Ellen, not to give the story away, because you can read the story 1,000 times and get something out of it. It's just literary genius. Dostoevsky is talking about a grand inquisitor like Paul V, who made rules for the people that came under his jurisdiction, like a bishop does, huh? And he made rules, but they were rules that differed from the teaching of Jesus. And he did these things because Jesus' teachings were just too hard, and he was having mercy on them. He was being a merciful person. Because to follow Jesus was just too hard. And so they obeyed him. They were nurtured in him being the word of God, being the communicator of Jesus' way and everything else, huh? And of course, he had the priest and the others all doing the same thing, carrying out that objective, Teach them that you really got to be concerned about eating meat on Friday, huh? It's a mortal sin. That is, he taught them rules that were in their ability to obey, And he does, right? This is the whole setup that he's nurturing all through the institution, on and on, and he's just one in a line of people to do this. Rules that they can obey. Now, it turns out one day, Jesus appears. Fully human, fully himself. He just appears in the town. He doesn't say a word. But people know it's Jesus. People know it's Jesus. And the minute they see him, they gravitate to him just by his presence, just by his demeanor, just by his love, his radiance. It's there. It's fully there. And they gravitate to him. And the Grand Inquisitor becomes furious. And he has Jesus arrested again. And he brings him in. He says, I know who you are. He says, and I'm telling you, get out of here. We don't want you. You will just make life too hard for people, and these simple people are not up to living what you asked. You You fill them not with peace. I fill them with peace because I give them something they can live. I give them something they can do. What you tell them is you've got freedom, therefore live by the will of God, which says love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, you know? No. That's not real life. I know real life. You get out of here. You either get out of here or I'll have you killed. And so, as it turns out, when the Grand Inquisitor forces Jesus out of town because gets him out of there, all the people who loved Jesus and saw the holiness and just basked in the goodness and love of Jesus, who has never said a word, return instantly to the Grand Inquisitor and his measly little rules as the way to live the Christian life. He says to Jesus, these are the words at the end, famous words, depart and come back no more. And Dostoevsky wrote that.
Wait, what were the last words?
Depart and come back never again.
Depart?
Jesus. Depart, leave, depart.
Oh, depart and come back no more. Wow, okay.
And that's what the church has done.
Yeah, do you know if Dostoevsky had the same views as Tolstoy when it came to violence?
No, he did not. He was an Orthodox Christian all his life. Tolstoy was thrown out of the Orthodox Church. And of course, the Orthodox Church never had a Grand Inquisitor. This was the Catholic Church. But Dostoevsky, if you read the whole Brother Karamazov, you'd see that it is a book that is one into the other, that is struggling with the spiritual reality of the gospel. And this is the highlight, if you will, of one of the highlights of the book, the little short story. But depart and return never again. And the people return instantly to the Grand Inquisitor, and he throws a few threats out there of what's going to happen if they don't return. So they're going to fall back into place. And they're happy living, no meat on Friday, and simultaneously, killing for the king.
Mm-hmm.
Meat on Friday is a mortal sin. Killing for the king, there's no sin. If the king calls for it. Follow the king rather than Jesus, no problem. But because the Grand Inquisitor told them and nurtured them in that, and not in what Jesus taught, they don't sin. Now, here's the catch. But the Grand Inquisitor knows what's the truth. He knows the truth. So the question is, Ellen, and this is Dostoevsky, huh? The question is the Grand Inquisitor a Christ-like figure? Because he is taking on the burden of these poor people, which is for him, he's telling them what is not the truth. He's probably going to go to hell for it, but he's accepting the suffering so they won't have to suffer with the truth that Christ brought. He is being merciful to them. Is he a Christ-like figure for accepting suffering so that these people will have just the little peace that peasants want, They want a few drinks. They want to play cards,
That kind of reminds me of that. I didn't read the book, but the movie Silence, where mercy becomes, I'm going to renounce Christ to be merciful to these people. It's a really weird, because the Japanese government was like, we're going to keep killing Christians until you renounce Christ. And it's like, well, it becomes this kind of twisted mercy where it's a merciful act to renounce Christ in order to prevent the violence and suffering. Do you know what I'm saying?
Well, basically what it is idolatry. You make yourself God. You communicate the will of God to people. And therefore, in communicating that to people out of that position, well, you're the Cardinal and Grand Inquisitor, you're the church, and people believe you. And therefore, you have them align yourself with your spirit and so forth, so that you can control and govern their lives under the auspices of giving them a little bit of peace, which Jesus, he says himself, my peace I give you, but not as the world gives peace, do I give you peace. So he says himself, it's not those who say, Lord, Lord, but those who do the will of the Father. And how much of Christian theology, Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, operationally is really being fans of Jesus and not doing the will of God as revealed by Jesus. I mean, this is, so Dostoevsky it's a profound little story in the middle of Brothers Karamazov. And really, Ellen, before you turn 80, you should get to it.
Well, I better get to it pretty soon then. Life is flying by. I remember just last week I was engaging on YouTube with Adrian. If you're out there and you're listening, Adrian, someone on YouTube, was calling me out and saying, Ellen, is this what you have for your listeners? Is this what you have in store for your listeners? Suicide? This gospel nonviolence stuff? And I didn't write it, but I wanted to say, eyes have not seen and ears have not heard, what God has in store for those who love him. But yeah, it's just hard to kind of crack open, like, as we've been talking for 2 hours now, it's hard to crack open this issue without, it's just hard for people to understand because they've just been left in the dark for so long.
Not only left in the dark cognitively, conceptually, huh? They have no idea, but emotionally. Like the man said, what are you saying? Commit suicide?
Yeah, he thinks that gospel nonviolence is the equivalent of just suicide. Yeah. That you're just letting yourself die. No, but you're learning how to live, right?
But and I know, as I say in my various places and CDs and so forth and so on, nonviolence is related to the gospel is an adjective. It's not a noun. Jesus teaches a way of non-violent love. Love is the noun. Love is the noun. We often say, Ellen, let you think about this for a while. How many times have we heard on television and radio, Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox people talking, evangelicals, Jesus says, pick up your cross and follow him. And all kinds of things. You've got to pick up and your cross might be this or your cross might be that. And the part they forget is he says, follow me. Pick up your cross and follow me, not just pick up suffering. It's follow me that's the issue. Life is full of suffering, but it's loving in the context of the sufferings of life that is redemptive. That is the way of Jesus. Not killing or causing harm or doing violence or hating or revenge or retaliation in the face of suffering. That is the way of God for the redemption of each and every one in humanity. It is loving within the context of stuff. Love as I have loved is the teaching of Jesus. And when he, on the cross, it's not mere animal pain that saves. Jesus on the cross, just suffering mere animal pain is nothing. Jesus doesn't teach that mere animal pain saves. Love saves. Jesus on the cross is loving as God loves. That is, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. This day you will be with me in paradise. It's Jesus loving in the face of suffering, called suffering love in some cases, but that's what we're called to. And by the way, that's available for any one of us to do who drives a car in Boston and people cut us off. And instead of giving them the finger or screeching a bit of vulgarity out the window, they say a prayer for them. Loving as Jesus. Yeah, the suffering is there. I mean, whether it's cancer or whether it's whatever it is. That's there. That's the given of human existence. The task is to love through it, in spite of it. So Jesus is not saying pick up your cross and suffer. He's saying pick up your cross and follow me, which means love as I love. That's not suicide. You're not going out and saying to the guy, kill me. No, you approach the person, and in the process, you are loving. You are trying to love him as Jesus would love him, even though he's going to kill you, as Herod and the high priest and so forth killed Jesus. And who is in need, Ellen? Who is more in need of a manifestation of Christ-like love in this world than the person with murder in his heart? A baby?
Yeah, I've been reading a book about St. Maximilian Kolbe and all the testimonies about him, things that people said about him. And yeah, he was nice to the German soldiers who imprisoned him, and he won them over. And I think he even wrote one of their mothers a letter and said, I just want you to know that, your son was really kind to me when I was in jail. Like, he was constantly reaching out to anybody. It didn't matter whether they were the enemy or about to starve him to death. He was the same toward everyone.
Jesus on the cross is not a statement that animal pain saves. Jesus on the cross is a statement that love is how we should live unto death. That's what it's about. And by the way, if Jesus didn't die on the cross under those terrible, terrible circumstances, which we can't even imagine today what it was, but they're certainly as painful and as hard as anything else that goes on in this world, then we could always say, yeah, but Jesus says, love as I have loved, but he never lived through the real crises of loving, the torment, the terror, the torture, all the humiliation. He never lived through that. He didn't mean to live in that situation. That's basically what the Just War says. Yes, he did. He did it. He did it. He didn't. Didn't Jesus know you could use violence if you wanted to? Sure, he did. But he didn't do it. He loved through it. And that's critical, because the Just War theory is a denial of that.
Right. I have another question. I think you can answer it with a yes or no. Can I ask?
Oh, yeah, go ask. I can give yes or no's, yeah.
Okay, so I think you can. I'm not sure. So it's kind of a long question, but somebody asked it on YouTube. Since the political state is principally a violent response to a violent world, do we conclude that the idea of a Catholic confessional state is a self-contradiction?
It is.
I thought you could answer that one fast.
Yeah. There is no such thing. There's no such thing as a Christian state. There is no state that follows the teaching of Jesus. None. Zero. It never has been. And the fact is, there never will be, because Catholics, Protestants, Orthodox, they don't believe that Jesus' teachings can be followed, and therefore they never try to implement them. So that possibly, way, way out on the horizon, there could possibly be something called a Christian state. But since Christians are so sure that Jesus' teachings are unrealistic and can't work, and they're no good in this world except to die, then a Christian state will never arise.
Got it. And one more, this you could probably answer quickly too. How do contact sports fit into the idea of gospel nonviolence? Is there a difference between something like boxing, where violence is the primary goal and damaging a person's body is the primary goal, and a sport like football, where violence is a secondary effect? This is something someone was curious about.
Oh, I think that I think that now I boxed a little, and I can tell you, with whatever yoga-like piece you walk into the ring with, the minute you get that first hit in the nose, it's gone. That's not the way it works. Now, what I'm using there, why I use that is because we continually got to look at metanoia, change of mind. When you get hit in the face, that changes your mind. If you're in there and the intention is to fight back. And so I think that we can ask ourselves, first of all, are there sports that are intrinsically violent? And therefore, when people play them, at the moral moment when they're participating in them, do they have to choose to hurt other people? I think the answer to that is yes. I would say football, hockey, boxing are two of them. Maybe others, soccer, I don't know. Are there sports that are nonviolent? Well, that's a different question. Because the question there involves if people feel hurt when they lose, do you want to be participating? Do you want to be a participant in that? Is there, for example, theoretically a nonviolent basketball game would be nonviolent? We know it isn't because it's degenerated over the decades, but theoretically it is. Huh? You don't have to hit anyone, don't ever hurt anyone. But what you do have to do is, if it's a competitive game, you have to hurt someone by losing. The joy of victory and the agony of defeat, as they used to say on CBS Sports, And it's a good thing to put people in agony, or can you find something else to do with your time? That I'm not talking about physical exercise. I'm talking about winning over people instead of winning them over. Those are two different things. So I would say this: there is a moral principle in the Catholic Church that I think is kind of sound. It governs all the moral theology, and it is doubt favors the possessor. Doubt favors the possessor. If after serious and conscientious thought, you are still 50-50. Is this violent or isn't it violent? Maybe even 40-60. That is, you're 40% sure, but 60%, maybe even down to that. You got that level of doubt. Now, we're not talking about laxism where you say, is blowing someone's face off with a flamethrower violent? Of course it is,
Yeah.
We're not talking. We're talking about these marginal situations. So doubt favors the possessor. If something is 50-50, 40-60, then the principle doubt favors the possessor says you can do it. You can do it because you are not choosing with full consciousness of something being evil and with total freedom that it is evil. Now, it also recognizes, that in the actual human situation, most of the time we are in those kinds of situations, a lot of times anyway. So what is the Christ-like thing to do here? What is Christ-like loving in this situation? See? And if I'm a lineman in a football game and I give the guy opposite me a forearm in the head or, the neck or whatever, is that the Christ-like thing to do? Well, it's a game. It's I don't know. I can't answer that for you. You can't answer that for me. I would say that probably, from my side of it anyway, I would say that certainly boxing is out of the question. Because having done it, I know what the spirit is that you do it in. And it's not the spirit of Christ. And even just on a practical level, the damage to the brain, which no one talks about in boxing, it's just football. But Yeah, on these marginal questions, Ellen, marginal questions, the church got a pretty good understanding how you apply moral principles, which is, well, just to carry the whole thing out, you can't be a rigorist. That's forbidden by the church. You can't have absolute certainty on anything, and that's forbidden to require that of anyone.
That's
But
interesting.
yeah, you can't have absolute physical certainty on anything, or certainty from God's eye view, that God says this action, mind you, in this place and time is evil. You can't, or good. You can't know that with certainty. And it's forbidden to teach people that you can know that with certainty. But what you have to have is what the church calls moral certainty. You have to be morally certain, which is different than being physically certain or metaphysically certain. Within your own conscience, you have to be morally certain that this is a good action or this is not an evil action. And that, what we're talking about there is the primacy of conscience again. So much depends. Now, the other side, way down the line with that is, it's called laxism, not rigorism. It's the other side of rigorism. It's laxism. And which means there's a modicum of evidence and certain emotions that say, yeah, this could be all right. But when you give it the test, is this 50-50 for me, or even 40-60? I don't know. It isn't. It doesn't seem what you can't go beyond that, because that's just making up things. But the question of, remember the great statement by Jesus that governs, that the church says is the supreme law of the church. It sums up the whole, all the other laws, is what is meant by the terms of Our Father, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, which is the new commandment. Love one another as I have loved you. That has to be applied in the practical situation. And in the practical situation, what is required is not physical certainty, not metaphysical certainty, but moral certainty, which means if you ponder the Gospels, read the Gospels, and ask Jesus to guide your conscience in loving as he does, and then you come into the moral situations every day and you say, what would Jesus do here? You still have to make a practical decision. Is it yes or is it no? Is it loving as Christ loved or not? And that practical decision has to be with moral certainty, but not with the absolute certainty that you would have if you had God's eye view, and not with absolute, and of course not with laxism that you're just doing it because you want to enjoy it, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. So those that's basically briefly what everyone should be taught in terms of the just war also. That is you can't have metaphysical certainty now, that is from God's eye view. You can't have from God's eye view that going into this war because Obama or Trump say to go, or Bush say to go into it, is good. But what you've got to have is loving as Christ loved. In other words, that's good in the Christian context. But what you have to have is moral certainty, that going in and killing the people 7,500 miles away in Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria, that is what Jesus would do. You have to at least have a 50% certainty that that's what Jesus would do. So that's what's behind. When the biblical scholar I mentioned before, John L. Mackenzie, when he writes that if you want to burn witches in good Christian conscience, all you have to do is prove to yourself that Jesus, meaning the Jesus of the gospel, not the Jesus of private revelation, the Jesus of public revelation in the gospel, all you have to do is prove to yourself now, that's your own conscience, that Jesus would have burnt witches. But if you can't do that, then you can't burn witches.
Got it. And you, wasn't John L. Mackenzie your professor?
I had John teaching scripture when I was getting graduate degrees in theology at Notre Dame, to me. And I became very, 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 very good friends with him when I was on the faculty at Notre Dame. And when I was at Notre Dame defending some students during the Vietnam War 50 years ago, who had sat in front of a door, a recruiting office that was simultaneously had Dow Chemical and CIA recruiting in there. And Dow Chemical and CIA during the Vietnam War were the Hitler symbols of the war. Huh? They were just agents of atrocity, overwhelming atrocity, and therefore had become almost universally symbols of the terribleness of war. And the University of Notre Dame brought them in to recruit students, and some students sat and protest out in front of the doors, and Ted Hesburgh had them arrested and called the police in, and they went to court. And I was defending them. Huh? I was a lawyer at the time, and I was defending them all during that time. And all during that time that I was defending them, and then with all the trouble that followed that, and so forth and so on, and with the program I was running, program in study and practice of nonviolence at Notre Dame, every time that I was in the faculty lounge and I was sitting there alone, Mackenzie would come over and sit down. And everyone wanted to be around Mackenzie, so that meant everyone would come over the table. And he was very, very good about that. He knew, he's straight out on the nonviolence of Jesus, nonviolence of the gospel, and he didn't hesitate to say it. And I'll tell you an interesting thing in terms of how you should love as Christ loved. In terms of that's what we were talking about, and applying it in terms of having moral certainty or not having it. Back on October 15th of 1969, I and some other people in the program of nonviolence, we constructed a protest for that day. At that time, it was called Moratorium Day all over the country. And our protest that we constructed was, we had a mass out in front of the library, in the big lawn out in front of the library. And I brought Archbishop Roberts from India there, who was a bishop who believed in the nonviolence. And there were other people that celebrated the mass and so forth. And at the mass, some people burned their draft cards and put them on the paten and so forth and so on. And that was the protest of the day that we had. Okay. So there were several priests that celebrated. And we asked Mackenzie if he'd want to celebrate. And we told him what was going to be done, tearing up of draft cards and burning them. And he said no. And he said, not that I think the war is anything but evil, but he said, as I see it, the way that I do my job of loving in the church is by scholarship. And as I see it, integrity requires that if I'm going to be part of a criminal activity, that is the tearing up and burning of draft cards, which was a criminal offense, I have to be willing to take the full punishment of it. And quite frankly, he said, I can't do very much biblical scholarship in prison. And therefore, my decision is that for me, I'm deciding that I do not want to celebrate that mass. So I'm not saying that would be the decision that I would make, but he was not being glib about it. He was just not saying, I don't want to risk committing a crime. He was saying that as far as I can see, the way I'm supposed to love in the church, my ministry to love in the church, is scholarship, and I can't do it in prison. Now, he knew there was going to be very little chance of anyone being arrested. In fact, no one was. But integrity required that he be willing to accept that if that's what he was going to participate in.
Right.
Which was also Gandhi's point too, that the task is not to try to get out of prison after you've committed a crime of civil disobedience. The task is to accept it, and in accepting the suffering is an agency for making people think in a way that will bring about conversion, make them think about what they're doing. Why would people accept this suffering in order to make this point? That's all.
Yeah. That's interesting segue, because the last question I wanted to ask you.
This is the last. This is the very last.
I promise. So I think Jim Douglas is going to come on the podcast pretty soon, and I'm excited about that. And Jim Douglas was your first visiting professor during this time, right? With the Center for the Program.
Yeah, he's the first person I hired. Yeah.
Yeah. So you hired him at Notre Dame. He was there during this whole time.
Mm-hmm.
I just thought it'd be kind of interesting. Like, is there anything that you would suggest I ask him about, or any questions that you would suggest I ask him? I don't know. Just.
By the way, Jim was one of the people that tore up and burned his draft card at the Mass.
Oh. Okay.
Yeah.
It all comes full circle. And the first time I ever met you, I met Jim at the same time. So yeah, what should I ask him? Like, what would be?
I met you up at Agape in Ware, Massachusetts.
Exactly, and I'm still trying to get Suzanne and Brayton on the podcast. We can't. We've been trying for a couple months, but one day they're going to get on here.
Yeah. No, so you didn't meet Jim first with me.
Oh no, the weekend that you visited Agape was for Jim, when Jim was publishing his book about JFK.
Oh, I see.
And there was the pagoda, the Peace Pagoda thing, and you and Jim were both at Agape.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so that was the weekend, huh?
Yeah.
Well, that was a very graced weekend, you know?
It was amazing, because I don't
change your life.
It really did, Father. It no doubt did. It was like, sometimes I feel like that's the whole reason I went there. I just knew I was supposed to go there. And of course, I learned so much from Suzanne and Brayton, but I think about it, and I don't think you get to Agape that frequently. So the fact that our visits overlapped, I don't know. It did feel very meaningful.
Then, wait a minute. Then someone at Agape, or was it Mike Boover from Worcester? I gave a weekend retreat at Assumption College, and you were at that.
Yes. Yes, I was at that. That's right. I forgot Mike Boover put that together, and we're still friends on Facebook. And I need to get him on this podcast too.
Mike's a good guy, and you ought to get Chidi on the broadcast too, from England.
I do. I want to hear about his experiences with.
Yeah, you ought to, and I can give you some names that would be good to get on. You mentioned John Botine, the bishop. Yeah, I'd say, Ellen, yes, use my name. Say that I suggested him, and that may get you no place, but use it, and say that you want to talk about nonviolence.
Okay.
He can explain it quite well, and coming, the whole thing of the just war and war is such a tiny part of it,
Right.
But he can explain the whole thing pretty well, very well, and he's a bishop doing it, and people take some kind of attentiveness to what he's saying,
Yeah, no, I'd love to talk to him.
Yeah. Those are, and I wonder if you should talk to Peg and Greg about their nonviolent curriculum that they have,
Oh, yeah, that'd be good too.
No, because people are always looking for tools to teach this at a younger level,
Mm-hmm.
And they got them. They've worked hard at that for a long, long time. And gosh, there's so many nonviolent saints out there, There's an Episcopal priest up in Nova Scotia, a woman by the name of Lorraine Street, who's been to about 20 workshops of mine, and she teaches it, preaches it, and she's a bit of a scholar, and she's done some very serious scholarly work confronting the efforts by scholars to say that the fifth commandment, thou shalt not kill, reads thou shalt not murder. It does not. It says thou shalt not kill. And just about every church in Christianity has changed it to thou shalt not murder, except the Catholic Church, because the word means kill. The interpretation is murder later on by people.
Oh, that's interesting. And that would be good to interview her, because I need a woman on this podcast.
Right. And she's quite available and quite articulate. And oh gosh, there are so many people that you could talk to. But I think really, Ellen, actually, you don't really need them all. Just talk to me.
Yeah. At this rate, you're like my every third interview, because I always have more to talk to you about and ask you about.
Oh, right down there in Atlanta, huh? Look at those people that have been working at it for so long. I mean, people like Joe Good.
Oh, I know. I love Joe. He listens to the podcast. Hi, Joe, if you're listening. Now we're just talking about mutual friends. But...
yeah, I know. We're just brainstorming on people to talk to, and I can at least people from the time in Notre Dame, like you don't know this person, but Mark Bartolomano, he was back there in the 1960s and 70s, and he's still with it. And
I'd love to talk to one of your former students about that experience. And
yeah, that's Mark. He'd be the one to talk.
How it affected his life? Did he end up on the streets? Never could get a job? You know, that kind of stuff.
Hardly. No. There's just a lot of good people out there that have worked hard at this. You know.
Yeah.
And they've gone different ways. You know. I mean, I've probably been. I don't know how many people I've converted to Gospel Nonviolence, but over the years, by retreats and so forth, I've certainly brought a lot of couples together to get married, you know? So I'm kind of a matchmaker, you know?
Are you really?
Yeah, they meet somehow at and through my retreats, and then lo and behold, you know, they wind up doing stuff and getting together and finally getting married and having children, and I never hear from them again.
Really?
Yeah, no. I'd say 99.99% of the tens or I don't know how many thousands, hundreds of thousands of people I talk to, I don't hear a word from. But that's okay. It's only about a mustard seed, you know. Every once in a while, I'll come across someone, on the street, or someone will call and they'll say something like, "Oh yeah, I took your retreat. You know, really did this, changed my life. I've never thought, you know," and that's all. That's fine, you know. That's the mustard seed approach.
Yeah, they don't come back and tell you that they named their son Charlie or anything like that.
No, I'll tell you. Remember, Ellen, it's Emmanuel Charles McCarthy. You keep saying that father thing. Well, don't you read the Gospels? Jesus says, "Call no man your father," and I'm a man.
Okay, fine.
Charles McCarthy, or as I've been called Charlie, or I've been called Mac in my day, and what else? Charlie, Mac. I guess those are the two. Yeah.
Yeah.
So Charlie is the one I go by though, and but these are there's plenty of people out there to talk to that could really, you know. I mean, I think of there's a guy who runs a Catholic worker house, and I could get you his name, but he's been at it for about 40 years in New Mexico and Arizona, and he is really learned and quite articulate on the whole subject of nonviolence and on and on and on. You got there's a lot of people.
Yeah.
So I don't know why you just keep calling me and saying last question.
Because all you're doing is sitting around and eating bonbons every day.
Well, that's probably true. No, that's probably true. You know, I'm just here. It's a little difficult these days, as I say. People don't ask me to give talks anymore. You know, that's it. That's terrible, isn't it?
Well, I mean, I just feel like you should still be. That's what you were born to do, and you should still be doing it. And so, if I can,
absolutely right. I should have a television show like Johnny Carson, you know, once a week, or like Bishop Sheen.
You really should. And
Yes.
the other thing I think you should do is you should start your own podcast and do a Sunday sermon on the reading, because I'm always leaving church going, that was good, but I wonder what Charlie would say about that.
Well, that what I told you earlier in the thing about pick up your cross and follow me.
Yeah.
Pick up your cross was in last Sunday's reading, and follow me. But the priest gave this long sermon on just accepting your sufferings. Said nothing about love.
Right, like it applies to if you get a cancer diagnosis or something. Like that's what it applies.
No, and that's So that's every Sunday. The Gospels all talk about nonviolence in one way or another. But if you don't know it, see, if you've never heard it, if you have no base, or even you don't even ever thought about it, what are you going to do? You know?
Right.
You can't even think about it. You can't. It's like. What do they call it in sociology? The nomos. The nomos is the taken for granted knowledge that a person is nurtured in a society. So, for example, in a Hatfield society, the McCoys, it's taken for granted they're evil, In the McCoy society, they're nurtured from childhood to think the Hatfields are evil. And so, the Hatfields and McCoys, don't you?
Oh, yeah. I've heard of that.
But once you're nurtured into that as a child, and it's structurally reinforced as you go on in life, you can't even think that it's not so. In those societies, only a poet or a prophet could possibly see through it. You can't even think. You can't even ask the first question. It's just taken for granted knowledge is what they call it, the nomos.
Mm-hmm.
So it's an emotional thing, not just a cognitive thing. Your whole psyche is involved. In fact, your whole self-image is involved in it, and your God image.
Mm-hmm.
God hates the Hatfields too.
Yeah.
No, that's the way the world is, in fact, in this moment in time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so look, Ellen, I don't know. Say hi to Tim for me,
Tim? My dad?
Yes.
Oh, I will.
Your guy. Now, there would be an interview. You could interview him about how wonderful you've made his life since getting married.
Oh, you mean Tom? Oh,
Tom,
yes. That would be a long interview. It would be longer than our interviews. I mean, all the things he'd have to say.
And all the things you've done to make his life happy.
Oh, yes, and miserable sometimes.
Oh, no, never. You and Tom, did I say Tim? I must be thinking my own son, yeah. Anyway, you and Tom, I'm sure if you get on the interview here, you could plan it, see? And you can tell people how to be happy in the first year of marriage as Christians.
Ah, I like that.
See?
Yeah.
And give my salutations and my blessing to Teresa also.
Oh, I will. Yes, Teresa, she's a doll. But then, Charlie, you'd have to tell us how to be happy in the 50th year of marriage?
Yeah, the next 52.
Yeah. Yeah, that would be a good episode.
I can tell you that. Just believe that Christ is risen and love as Christ loved, and you got it.
That sounds good.
It's as simple as that for your whole audience,
Yes. Well, I'm thinking about you and Mary a lot, praying for you guys. And your whole family.
We need it. We're just this is a very, very odd sort of life right now.
Right.
Very odd. But this is whatever God puts on your plate, that's what you got to love through.
Right.
Now, did you ever hear that before? Whatever God puts on your plate, you have to love with?
You have to love with. No.
Yeah. That's it. Whatever the suffering is, you got to love through it.
Yeah.
That's what, Jesus could have said that instead of pick up your cross. He said, whatever I put on your plate, follow me.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So, Alan, I think we've exhausted I don't know, probably all those CIA, NASA, Mossad, people, MI16 people who are listening to us, just just tired now, you know?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I think that you're on a list for sure. And so I'm
I,
probably on a list by association. That's
yeah,
okay.
it is something to be said that to be said for the fact that if we are in the worlds of genetic alteration and nanotechnology and all that stuff there, huh? That if the church doesn't start communicating the spirit that Christ taught in metanoia, lived, uh, presented to the world in his words and deeds, if it keeps with no meat on Friday, if it keeps with that, it's not going to. I don't know. It's not going to be around as long as we think. But then again, the church will be around forever, because Christ guaranteed its survival. Just didn't guarantee it was going to survive in the way it is.
Right. With yeah.
You know, yeah. The
Yeah.
church survives because Christ guarantees its survival, not because of money or clever administration and so forth. And because that survival is guaranteed, the church, meaning the church leaders, the priests, etc., people, should have no fear of loving as Christ loved.
Right. We have nothing to lose. That yeah.
Everything to gain. Everything to gain, not nothing to lose. Everything to gain.
Well, yeah, but nothing that's ultimately necessary to lose. Is that a better way of putting it?
Not say that again.
We have nothing to lose that's ultimately necessary.
That would be a that would be a very complicated way using negatives and
Yeah. Right. Well,
okay, Ellen. Take care.
Next time. Thank you so much, Charlie.
Oh, sure, it's fun. It's fun. Okay, and edit this well. You know, don't make me look like a jerk. You know.
Oh, you know what? It's all good. I think people will stick with us for 2.5 hours. Don't you think?
No, you got you got to separate it into like 3 45-minute things. You know.
Yeah, that's probably true. All right. Next time we've got to start with a joke. Okay.
We'll start with a joke. I could start with a joke.
Okay, because this podcast is pretty serious sometimes, but I know you can be pretty funny. So.
Well, I mean, gee whiz, if you want me to do stand up, you know, I mean, you know, I'll tell you, someone said something to me once in a retreat, you know, after a retreat. He said, now this is long, long ago, okay? This is in the 70s. And this gets to the joke thing. Because I always felt in the retreat, you know, you had to give people a little comic relief.
Yeah.
As you go through, you know, and therefore you can't just pull in stupid jokes. Somehow they have to be consistent with the content, you know.
Yeah.
So this guy came up to me and he said, you know, this 1975, something like that. He came up to me and he said, you know, this was a good retreat, but he said, you've got to learn to stop going for the joke when it's there, you know.
Really?
Yeah. And you know what I said to you tonight sometime? I said, I've got to check your baptismal certificate to see if you're really Catholic. You know, I made that as a joke during a question and answer period up in Vermont at a Catholic college and it caused turmoil. The person thought that I was questioning their Catholicity. They didn't get it as a joke, you know?
Oh, that's a bummer.
Yeah, and so you got to be jokes on the internet, jokes overseas. Yeah, you never know, Ellen, you know?
Yeah, that's true. And I'll never forget something Brayton said about you, actually, because at some point I started emailing you and I said, you know, I miss you or something. I miss talking to you. And you emailed me like a picture of yourself. And you said, oh, here, if you start missing me, here's a picture of myself. And I remember telling Brayton about that. And he's like, that's funny, you know. And he said, Charlie never used to be like that. He used to be really serious. But He's gotten a lot more jovial as he's gotten older.
Oh, yeah. I got a lot more jovial. I tell you, I tell you that if you only knew me before I got married, before I got married, you would have. I was a barrel of laughs.
And then life got serious when you had the 13 kids, right? Yeah.
Well, it does kind of put a damper on your comedic creativity, you know?
Got a lot on your mind. Well,
You
I've had one in the past week, just in the last week, and it changes things. Oh my goodness.
you bet. I mean, Teresa's. How did you find out which Teresa she is?
Oh, well, I forgot. I have to text her dad and find out. She's a foster child.
Yeah. But
But
in the correct spelling. What's the spelling?
Theresa. But it's
All right.
it's Teresa. It's like
Teresa would be French.
It's the Spanish pronunciation, but I think she thought it was
Teresa of Avila, then probably, huh?
I don't know.
That's Spanish,
Yeah, it's important. Yeah, I've got to figure it out.
Well, you know the story about Mother Teresa, you see. It's in Eileen Egan's book. Eileen spent a lot of time with Mother Teresa, and she wrote a book on her, and Eileen tells the story of how there was a very, very conservative journalist from a very, very editor from a very, very conservative American magazine. And he was interviewing Mother Teresa and talking about all the good things the conservatives talk about Mother Teresa about. It's in Eileen Egan's book. You can see the actual quotes and situation. But anyway, he said to her, Mother Teresa, you do all this mercy and so forth, but what do you think about war? There's a lot of mercilessness in war. And she said, I don't believe a Christian can go to war. And he said to her, which is what I was taught, and he was still teaching, but it was wrong. He said, but if you're a Catholic, you have to go to war if your country calls you. And she said, and this is a great line, she said, then am I not a Catholic? Perfect answer. But she was straight out. She was absolutely convinced that war was the demarcation. You couldn't do it.
Yeah, and she had a great quote too that connected abortion and war. Like any country that allows for war will end up allowing abortion or vice versa. Like they're connected, more than we like to admit.
They are connected, but I think I remember the quote as being just the way you said it the first time. Wars were brought about by abortion, when it's the other way around historically.
Right. Like once you start to accept that many innocent deaths in the name of, quote, collateral damage, it's just the next step, I think, to be like,
it is the next. It is. No, it's the what would you say? It's a new loophole that has to be brought into consideration now that we have the technology to do it so efficiently and everything else. It's just it's a next step. Yeah,
and the pro-lifers make the same argument. They'll say, well, I'm not intending to kill the baby. I'm intending to end the pregnancy, and killing the baby is just the, like what happens as a secondary thing. It's like they use a lot of the same language. Well,
or I'm I'm intending to preserve my present family. We just can't afford another child, you know?
Yes, so the intention is not to kill, it's to do some other good thing. And this is the only way to accomplish that or
And
whatever.
that's exactly what politicians say.
Hmm.
We don't mean to kill. We just mean to bring democracy to whatever or whatever, you know?
Yep.
But Jesus doesn't say that. He says, the power that moves the universe, the power that moves the seas and the stars, the power from which all things come, and the power that creates harmony in this world and ends evil and death is love as I have loved. Because he's the Logos.
Right.
He is. Yeah, he is the one that made it all and keeps it all moving.
So he does not contradict himself.
No, he does not.
All right, Charlie. So is there anything I should say to Jim from you? Do you want me to at least say hi to him for you? Not
Oh
that you
yeah,
can't.
say hi, and I hope he and Shelley are all right and everything is fine, and that let me see what else I could say to Jim. Let me see. I can't. I guess I'm worried about the jokes. That's all. The jokes may be misinterpreted. No, just say hi and hope everything is well with him and Shelley and that keep up the good work, that sort of thing.
All right, that sounds good. I'd love to see a photograph of you two from back in your Notre Dame days. If you have one, will you send it to me?
Oh, I don't have one. Maybe the Notre Dame Archives has one. I don't know if that's so or not. But
you guys don't have a photo, really?
No, I never. No, not really. I wasn't much for taking pictures of myself like you. You take pictures of yourself all the time.
I saw.
It's very narcissistic, but I wasn't a narcissist.
Okay. Well, I saw a lot of pictures of you in Brayton and Suzanne's book too, which was really fun to see you cropping up in the book.
That wasn't me that took them.
Yeah, right. That was other people.
That's Suzanne Brayton and other people. But no, I think that maybe the Notre Dame Archives have some. And I think that when I gave a retreat down at Jim's place there, Catholic Worker House, I think we took some pictures together. I think we took some with John Carmody too. Yeah. But he might have them, but I don't.
Maybe I'll ask around.
Yeah, just ask him and
yeah.
And I still think his Nonviolent Cross is a great book. Great book.
I'm right now. I'm reading The Nonviolent Coming of God by him, but I should read The Nonviolent Cross too. It sounds like.
Oh yeah, the Nonviolent Cross is the seminal work, real seminal work, and real insightful, and it's really. In my mind, it's the best of what he ever did. Very best, Nonviolent Cross.
Okay, well that's good to know.
Yeah, it's a good book to start people with too.
Okay.
It's that kind of it's that kind of book. It's it's very well done logically and emotionally and rhetoric and everything else. It's I think it's beautifully done. Yeah, awesome. I've recommended it all over the place.
All right, Charlie. I'll let you get back to Mary.
Well, you keep in touch now. Ellen, and if there's anything I can do, how's your parents doing, Tim and Cindy?
They're great. They always listen. They tune in. They like to hear your voice. They always love to hear what you have to say. So I think they're slowly coming around.
Are they out there in Denver with you?
Oh, Colorado? Yeah, in Colorado. Yeah, they're out here. My mom just retired, so they're out here, and it's been fun. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So let me ask the critical question.
The Mustang is in.
Where's the Mustang?
The Mustang is in California with my older brother. He got it.
Gosh.
Yep.
Oh gosh.
He's going to pass it on to his son, who is now 6 years old. So he's got 10 more years before he can have the Mustang.
Oh my gosh. I'm afraid I'm going to have to give up my dream on this.
Well, Connor might not want it. So, and you're second in line. Absolutely.
Oh, right after, let's see, he's 6. He turned 16 in 10 years.
Yeah.
I'll be 90.
You can still drive the Mustang.
Oh, sure, I can still drive a stick shift. Yeah, no, I can do that, you know? But it was a great experience when I rode it. It was like deja vu when I rode with your father there to church that Sunday.
That was so fun. That was
Yeah,
great. I love those pictures.
it was. You got pictures of that?
Yeah, maybe I'll put it up on the Catholics Against Militarism blog. Here's Father McCarthy in a 1964 and a half Mustang.
Well, I think. By the way, did you ever get the picture that was the pen and ink drawing of me?
The which drawing?
Pen and ink.
Pen and ink. Yes.
Yeah, I thought I sent it to that girl you came to a retreat with, Michelle, or what was her name?
Ashley?
Is it Ashley? Yeah, I think I sent it to her and sent it to you at the same time.
Yeah.
Years ago, when you were just a young thing, you know?
Just a novice with gospel nonviolence.
And now, boy, you might be, who knows, you might even read Dostoevsky pretty soon.
Maybe, you never know. I think
How could you be in literature and not read Dostoevsky?
I've been wanting to read it ever since I read The Long Loneliness because Dorothy Day, I think that was her favorite book.
That's right.
And so it's been on my list. That was almost 9 years ago. So it's been on my list for a while. I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it soon.
Just, if you can't read anything else, read the Grand Inquisitor story.
Okay.
It's set off in a separate chapter, so you know.
Yeah, that sounds very applicable to everything we're talking about. So I have to read it.
That's right. I mean, Dostoevsky, you can even teach your classes with it. You know, he's a giant.
Yeah. I can't introduce my own books, but
Oh, you can. Oh, they
no,
German.
They
Oh,
kind of have the set curriculum, but we're reading the Iliad right now, which could be a whole different conversation.
what are you reading now?
The Iliad.
Again?
Oh yeah, we read it every year.
Every year. Oh, for the same course level, same class?
Yeah.
Oh.
But Charlie, there is a part in here. Do you remember the beginning when Achilles and Agamemnon get in the fight? Because Agamemnon is going to take Achilles' girlfriend away.
No, I don't remember go ahead.
That's the fight that starts like the whole thing. So then Achilles gets really mad, but Athene comes down to him. So he reaches for his sword and he's about to kill Agamemnon, and Athena comes down and says, "I have come down to stay your anger. Come then, do not take your sword in your hand. Keep clear of the fighting, though indeed with words you may abuse him." So the goddess tells him he can't physically kill Agamemnon, but he's allowed to abuse him with words. So then he goes and tells him off. And that pretty much starts the whole Iliad right there. Like they're in a fight for the next 16 chapters. And it was just reminding me of where we started this whole podcast with this idea of pacifism. And gospel nonviolence is about, so much more than just not killing people and not hurting people physically. And you see it right there in the Iliad that abusing someone with words and it leads to all this death and destruction. That's where it starts. Anyway, I just had to share that.
Sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me is a falsehood.
Right.
You've heard of sticks and stones, haven't you?
Oh yeah, I've heard that.
And I was brought up on that, but no, names can kill you.
Yeah.
Names can start wars,
Yeah, that's exactly, it starts a mini war between him and Agamemnon, and it leads to all, Achilles pulls out from the war, and then, all the Greeks start dying as a result, and it all goes back to that moment when, he didn't physically hurt him, but told him off, and that's where it all starts. So it just reminded me of that.
Because a knife can pierce the body, a bullet. But words can pierce the soul, the self-esteem, the person's sense of value, the person's sense of worth, And, that when when you begin to attack a person's sense of worth, maybe they got to defend that more than they have to defend their money pouch or something, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm. So anyway, Ellen, I'll leave you on that note of quasi wisdom and
quasi wisdom. I appreciate that, Charlie. Thank you so much for taking the time for me tonight.
okay, good, Ellen. Bye bye.
Bye.